Welcome. There are two major sources for Western imagery about the natural world, and both are religious in origin. One comes from ancient Greek and Roman myth. The other comes from the various Bibles of the Jewish and Christian religions. But, despite their distinct origins, these have often intersected. So today, we'll look at how ancient images and stories continue to shape our own perceptions of the environment. We'll also take a brief look at the philosophy of language, analyzing how metaphors convey moral ideals, thereby becoming something much more than just a means for comparison. When you were first introduced to metaphors, you were probably given a fairly simple definition in which a metaphor means that one thing is like another. So, by way of example, a metaphor would be, nature is like a web. But we often have habits of speech in which we drop the word like. In these instances, our metaphors are no longer clear-cut. Instead of saying, nature is like a web, we simply say, nature is a web. Do these two statements say the same thing? In fact, we have inherited any number of familiar phrases that sound like metaphors. But are they? Consider the term Mother Earth. Are we saying that our planet is like a mother? Or are we saying that our planet is a mother? These are two very different things. Furthermore, each of these statements has a different ethical pull. Think about it. How should you treat your mother? Is this the same as how you should treat someone who is like your mother? Unless something tragic has happened, almost everyone would agree that mothers deserve respect. So, when we talk of Mother Earth, should we treat the Earth with the same respect as our own mothers? More broadly, what kind of moral expectations are we trying to communicate with the language we use? All of this points to an important distinction. When we say that one thing is like another, we're using a metaphor. But, technically speaking, when we say that one thing is another, we're using something else. And that's called metonymy. In a metaphor, one thing is like another, but in a metonym, one thing simply is another. We may not realize it, but we often conflate these. Yes, we draw a comparison, but we're also trying to do something more, because we invest our metaphors with a significant amount of meaning and even expectation. You might say that the metaphor loses its poetry because it becomes more and more strict. To borrow from George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's famous book, Metaphors We Live By. With metonymies, symbolism is not arbitrary. And oftentimes, as metaphor becomes metonymy, its meaning becomes prescriptive. That is, it tries to communicate how things should be. But this is different than communicating something that is merely descriptive, which simply talks about how things actually are. Consequently, our metaphors, and especially our metonyms, are often invested with significant emotional resonance. We feel them deeply. And it's not uncommon that this emotion carries over into religious, political, and cultural spheres of activity. Those spheres of activity, the religious, political, and cultural, are not just spheres of metaphor and metonymy with their varying expectations. They are also spheres of myth. Admittedly, the word myth is ambiguous. Sometimes it's used in a negative sense. For example, claiming that something is just a myth. But, technically, the English word myth comes from the Greek word mythos, which simply means story. So, let's briefly unpack how broad the meaning of story actually is. Some stories are true, some are pure fiction, some stories have a core of truth, but are embellished. And sometimes the purpose of a story is not found in its literal details, but in its moral meaning. Consider this observation by the British philosopher Mary Midgley in her book, The Myths We Live By. Myths are not lies, nor are they detached stories. They are imaginative patterns, networks of powerful symbols that suggest particular ways of interpreting the world. They shape its meaning. The world of human meaning is a world of values, and we communicate these values through metaphor, metonymy, and myth. If we go back to the Greeks and the Romans, we find that nature was often sexed as female. This was, in part, simply a function of language. For example, the Greek word for nature is Phusis. It's a feminine noun, and is the origin of our word physics. The same is true of Natura, the Latin word for nature, which is also a feminine noun. In its earliest known uses among the Greeks, Phusis denoted the results of growth as well as birth. This is paralleled by the story of Gaia in Hesiod's Theogony. The word theogony means birth of the gods, and Hesiod's Theogony is one of the oldest surviving works on the Greek deities. Here, Gaia is the name of Earth, hence the image, which we still have today, of Mother Earth. And, like nature, Gaia's name is grammatically female. But beyond mythology, there are more philosophical discussions of nature too, and that is found in the statements by the philosopher Heraclitus, who once remarked, "Nature loves to hide." The idea that nature is hidden gave rise to the related belief that nature has secrets. From ancient times through today, artistic representations of nature have often thus personified nature as female, but also as veiled. There is a connotation here of sexual modesty. In the ancient world, women often wore veils in public. But when used of nature, the portrayal of veiling has a double meaning, because it also communicates to the viewer that they are ignorant of whatever the veil hides. There is a second, equally important source of Western ideas about nature, and that is found in the Bibles of the Jewish and Christian religions. Most important here is the story of the Garden of Eden. In the beginning, God creates everything as inherently good and then blesses it. Humanity is later created from the dust of the earth, and, for a time, they live in harmony with nature. But, in a cryptic episode, they rebel by eating forbidden fruit, which grows on a tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They are then punished with mortality and physical labor and kicked out of paradise. Humanity, from this point on, strives against nature in order to survive. There is a technical term for this, declension narrative. It's a narrative that declines, that is, one in which things get worse over time. But, notably, this is not far removed from another work by Hesiod, The Works in Days. Here, history begins with a race of humans made of gold. Notably, they didn't have to labor, and death was painless. But things got a little worse. In time, humanity was made of silver. And then, still worse, humanity was now made of bronze. The silver humans disregarded the gods, and the bronze humans made weapons. And although a race of heroes interrupted this declension narrative, Hesiod says that people today are the worst of all. For this race now is iron indeed, and never, night or morn, will leave off from their suffering, worn down by toil and woe. As in Genesis, humanity is defined by its need for survival, and just as death wins in Genesis with all humans now dying, death ultimately wins here too. The 17th century saw a new take upon some of these older ideas. On the one hand, there was a newfound belief in the human ability to restore lost knowledge, and even gather new knowledge, namely through experimentation. The most famous pictorial representation of this is probably here. It's an image found on the title page of Francis Bacon's utopian work, New Atlantis. Here we see Father Time dragging nature out of a cave. The Latin inscription reads, "Time reveals hidden truth." This draws upon the old idea that nature has secrets, but some have argued that this same image is one of sexual violence. The woman, representing nature, is bare-breasted. Her attacker, representing time, is an old man. But in this image, nature's secrets are represented sexually too. Time, as masculine, reveals, that is, exposes, nature's secrets, just as the body is exposed in sex. But here, this is not exposure by consent, it's exposure by assault. And this deeply upsetting image therefore raises a question about what we now call the scientific revolution. At what point is science a violent possession of nature? Because this is not an image of reverence, humility, or love. It's an image of power, in which the end justifies the means. And so again, we might ask, at what point do our myths and metaphors communicate something ethical, or, in this case, something profoundly unethical? If we think of myth as something restricted to the more distant past, we'll miss the fact that still today we not only reuse and repurpose various old myths, but we still believe, often quite fervently, in the values communicated through those stories. A good example comes from the 1970s, when there was an attempt, with some success, in repurposing Greek myth for the atomic age. This is called the Gaia Hypothesis. It was developed in the 1970s by the chemist James Lovelock and the evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis. The Gaia Hypothesis argues that the Earth itself should be understood as functioning like a physiological system. In his short collection of essays, We Belong to Gaia, Lovelock offered an extended consideration of how metaphor and myth might spur environmental responsibility. In his words, "You will notice I am continuing to use the metaphor of the living Earth for Gaia. But do not assume that I am thinking of the Earth as alive in a sentient way, or even alive like an animal or a bacterium. It has never been more than a metaphor, an aide-pensée, no more serious than the thoughts of a sailor who refers to his ship as she." And slightly later, he continues, "Metaphor is important because to deal with, understand, and even ameliorate the fix we are now in over global change requires us to know the true nature of the Earth and imagine it as the largest living thing in the solar system." And of course, with all of this, there is a desired ethical outcome. So what? Much of today's discussion is driven by a simple question. What ethical imperatives are communicated by the language we use? But behind this, there is a further concern, namely, the concern to change human behavior. Much of what we've looked at today is driven by the view that behavior is intimately related to our habits of speech. So, which comes first, our beliefs or our behaviors? If we change our habits of speech, if we change our metaphors, our metonyms, our myths, will our behavior follow? From this perspective, language, including myth, is like a kind of technology, and, rightly applied, it will lead to a change in behavior. Of course, this also raises the specter of propaganda, and the ability of language to not just convince or convert, but manipulate, and perhaps even coerce. Here, too, are big ethical questions, and they should not be ignored. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, my discussion of metaphor and metonymy is heavily indebted to George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's book, Metaphors We Live By. It's a genuine classic and a thoroughly readable survey of many kinds of metaphors, and their inescapability in our habits of speech and belief. For an equally readable consideration of myth and its importance in daily life, read Mary Midgley's book, The Myths We Live By. The titles for these first 2 books are similar, but their contents complement one another perfectly. Finally, of the many excellent surveys of Western ideas about nature, I highly recommend the following 2 books. First is Carolyn Merchant's classic work, The Death of Nature: Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution. Next is Pierre Hadot's book, The Veil of Isis, an essay on the history of the idea of nature. Merchant is an environmental historian, Hadot a specialist in ancient philosophy. She focuses more on the scientific revolution, he focuses more on antiquity. So, here again, these 2 books complement one another perfectly. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.